Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Sounds like it's working. Okay. So it's truly a pleasure to be here at Source Boston and to engage with all of you on behalf of the Food and Drug Administration, specifically the center where I come from, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I want to especially thank Josh Corman for inviting me to participate today. Josh and I have now had several opportunities to discuss some of the challenges, some of the pain points that the healthcare sector is facing with respect to cybersecurity, whether it's serving on a panel together, which we did this past winter, as well as connecting by phone. I get the sense that we are both very like-minded and are very passionate about these concerns and are avidly seeking approaches to address this multifaceted problem. One thing's for sure, there is no single solution and there's no single responsible party. And so the upside here, spoken as a true optimist, which I am, is that this space is abounding with opportunity to do better through innovation, through collaboration, and even at its very core by demonstrating a willingness and an openness to consider a shift in perspective. So last week I had the opportunity to participate in a meeting that's part of an initiative, a government initiative, known as the Cybersecurity Forum for Independent and Executive Branch Regulators. And as each of us went around the table, briefing our counterparts from different departments, different agencies within government on what we're doing on our different efforts on cyber, the common thread that emerged amongst all of us was that, we need to shift this conversation. We need to pivot from if something were to happen to when something happens. And we have to ask ourselves, and I ask you, how prepared are we to respond to a breach, an exploit, an attack? And let's take that even a step further. How resilient are we? Will operations grind to a halt in the face of an attack or a breach? Or are there measures and mitigations that are already in place to enable the continuity of operations, continuity of critical services? And you can imagine how important that is within the healthcare and the sector and within the hospitals. So healthcare and public health as a sector has seen a ramping up of activities over the past year. I know Jim Routh spoke yesterday. He's a good colleague of mine. Data breaches started last year around this time with community health services. Anthem, Primera has been in the news, and most recently announced as of last week, Care First. And when we look at these efforts, at these events, and recognize how large the attack surface is across our sector of healthcare public health, we understand that the sector's vulnerabilities are not confined to health insurance claims databases or electronic health records, but rather they could potentially affect the larger system of systems, if you will, and they can go across entire care delivery networks. So in fact, medical devices have been no stranger to media attention, right? There have been highlights over the past 10 days alone which demonstrate the momentum that's been building and ramping up around medical device cybersecurity concern. And I've highlighted on this slide a few, again, just within the recent 10 days. Why does FDA care about cybersecurity? Well, the answer lies within the scope of the public health concern. As you know, fewer and fewer medical devices are standalone boxes. Networked medical devices are ubiquitous today. They facilitate patient care in hospitals, in outpatient or ambulatory centers, in skilled nursing and rehab facilities, to name a few, and of course there are many others. And at the same time, they also introduce new risks. So as an agency that's concerned first and foremost with our patient safety, it's balancing those benefits against risks that gets at the very essence of what we do, of what FDA is charged with. And notwithstanding FDA's public health mission, presidential policy directives and executive orders over recent years have underscored the need to improve cybersecurity of critical infrastructure across the sectors. Most recently, I'm not sure if you're all aware of Executive Order 13691 that was issued this past February to promote private sector cybersecurity information sharing as a means of strengthening critical infrastructure. So over the past 2 years, we've come to learn a lot at CDRH, at FDA, about medical device cybersecurity, particularly through the lens of total product life cycle. And yet, truth be told, we're barely scratching the surface. So how would I characterize our medical device ecosystem within the context of cybersecurity? Well, these are some of the descriptors that come to mind. It's complex, evolving, highly diverse players and stakeholders that have competing needs. It's very tense, volatile, unpredictable, uncertain. There is nothing that is static about this space. You've got multiple moving parts, and we have to keep in mind that there are areas that are well outside of the medical device or healthcare ecosystem in the broader universe that are well beyond our control and that are continuously shifting. And these exert further influence and impact on this ecosystem. At FDA, we're constantly uncovering more of the unknown that needs to be incorporated in our thinking as we formulate what is a strategic approach to medical device cybersecurity. This is a strategy that knits together the capabilities that government, that FDA holds within its toolbox. So it includes the ability to articulate policy through guidance documents, educating, increasing awareness via outreach, and communication. So now that I've characterized, now that I have characterized the ecosystem, who are the players within it? So we have the medical device manufacturers, and that's whom we at FDA have regulatory authority over. And then you have the owners and operators and end users of medical devices that FDA does not regulate. We do not have oversight over that piece. As shown here, there are many parties with a stake in this space, whether it's our patients, professional societies, industry, researchers, healthcare providers, payers, VCs. Within the healthcare delivery organization, within the healthcare facility bubble alone, you can peel that back further, and we've got hospital administrators, IT personnel, biomed engineers, clinicians. So one need not belabor the point that the varied and what are often competing needs and pain points among these stakeholders can present a significant challenge. A fundamental step would therefore be to identify the common interests that folks can rally around towards a shared purpose, that purpose being to better secure devices and their connected systems. The critical message here, though, is that there's no one organization, there's no single government agency, there's no sole stakeholder, manufacturer, healthcare facility, provider, information security firm that is going to be able to solve these issues on their own. This requires what we call a whole of community approach. And note that I didn't say here a whole of government approach, because this is far more expansive than what government is capable of doing. And so understanding the challenges, understanding again what those pain points are, the hurdles, and yes, the opportunities to build creative solutions requires mobilizing the community, the entire medical device ecosystem. If you remember anything from this morning's talk, these are going to be my key takeaways. It's about establishing a cybersecurity risk management program. It's about making cyber hygiene paramount. It's about creating a trusted environment for information sharing. It's FDA's desire and its interest in seeking to foster this whole of community approach. Key point number 5, bullet here that I'm going to continue to emphasize periodically throughout my talk, to break certain myths that are out there. FDA does not require new submissions for software updates or patches for cybersecurity. And this is a critical aspect for folks to really understand. True, there are some exceptions. Those exceptions are when there's a safety or functionality concern of the device. But when we're talking about, by and large, enhancement of cybersecurity, routine servicing, manufacturers do not need to submit an application or a new notification to the FDA. And then the last point, we're not prescriptive with risk analyses. Many folks will ask with respect to guidance documents why we don't get further into the weeds, why we're not more granular. Because there is an opportunity here for manufacturers and for the community to develop the appropriate type of analysis that fits within the framework of the specific device and the environment. Okay. So, the roadmap for today's discussion. Let's start with understanding the current threat landscape. What are the recognized challenges for enhancing security of critical infrastructure in healthcare and public health? Secondly, it'll be about informing you specifically of what our program looks like. And third, about providing a glimpse into that vision ahead. So what are the considerations and challenges faced with regard to medical device cybersecurity? For simplicity, there really are two components to think about here. First, there are the characteristics of the devices themselves. These are more or less the intrinsic elements, such as the notion that they contain configurable embedded computer systems, that they're increasingly being interconnected, wirelessly connected, and then the last point here of legacy devices. Legacy devices present a huge challenge for the medical device community and for healthcare today. And then there's the use environment in which the devices reside today. And these are the extrinsic factors for which medical device manufacturers have really little, if any, control. So what are some of the key learnings that we know about the use environment? Well, number one, there are varied responsibilities for procurement, installation, and maintenance of devices. These are often siloed efforts within different organizations. There is variable control over what's placed on the network. And we've heard a lot about inconsistent training and education on security risks. When we talk about medical device vulnerabilities, the first thing to point out here again is that they are overwhelming and they're ubiquitous, and they will continue to manifest themselves. They're not going away. One cannot entirely eliminate them. Yet we can educate, and we have a responsibility to educate. And we can increase awareness and vigilance among our stakeholders, and we have a responsibility to do that as well, so that our stakeholders understand what the common vulnerabilities are and what they should be doing to introduce protective measures. We have, in fact, included some of these examples that are on this slide in a safety communication that FDA issued back a couple of years ago in June 2013, and reiterated some of these key features in a safety communication that FDA issued just 2 weeks ago with respect to a specific infusion pump, the Hospira pump, that is used for patient-controlled analgesia. So again, just some examples here to highlight the uncontrolled distribution of passwords, the failure to provide timely security software updates and patches. In our present landscape, there have been known incidents reported in the news. For example, there was a cath lab, a VA cath lab closure in 2010, and that was due to malware infecting computers that are used for a cardiac interventional procedure. And we've also been presented in recent years, as well as in recent months, with findings of vulnerability researchers who have demonstrated in a controlled setting a non-hospital setting, the capability to exploit medical device vulnerabilities. And they've included the very famous hacking of an implantable insulin pump by Jay Radcliffe, as well as 2 years ago, Billy Rios and McCorkle brought to our attention and to Department of Homeland Security's attention a package of nearly 300 or so medical devices that had hard-coded passwords. And over the past 12 months, we continue to hear about further vulnerabilities. Again, most recently, the Hospira pump vulnerability that has gotten a fair amount of attention. It's important to note here, so I want to make a very intentional statement here, that FDA is not aware of any intentional or unintentional exploit of any existing vulnerability that has resulted in a patient or patients being harmed or injured. However, that is not a reason to be lax with respect to cyber security practices. So remember what I said at the onset of my talk, it's not a matter of if, it's a concern as to when something could occur, and the fact that we need to be prepared and that we need to be resilient. So this kind of ends the initial background landscape of medical device cybersecurity. In the remaining time, I'm going to share with you more of the diverse cross-cutting activities that we've been involved with at FDA, at Center for Devices and Radiological Health, as we've been building out this more strategic program on medical device cybersecurity. I'm also going to spend some time on FDA's expectations regarding medical device cybersecurity risk management. So what are our overarching goals? Well, first and foremost, we have to meet our public health mission, which is that patients should have access to safe and effective devices. It's about raising cybersecurity awareness, and we ought to be leveraging knowledge that presently exists within other critical infrastructure sectors across industry. It's about promoting safety and security by design, by being able to articulate clear regulatory expectations through guidance documents. It's about promoting proactive vulnerability management and not having to be in this position of defensive or reactive posture. And once more, it's about fostering that whole of community approach. So our cybersecurity program has included multiple efforts in parallel. We continue to articulate our thinking for expectations through guidance documents, and our final guidance for content of pre-market submissions for managing cybersecurity in medical devices was published last October. We'll talk a little bit more about the pearls of that guidance later. In 2013, we recognized 25 standards that included both cybersecurity and the other side of that coin, interoperability. We continue to work on evaluating later or newer standards for purposes of FDA recognition that will be applicable to cybersecurity as well. We've issued public communications on the importance of shared responsibility within this space. That was in 2009. And then there have been two more recent safety communications to our stakeholders, one which I referenced in 2013 and a more recent one 2 weeks ago. And organizationally, what have we done? Well, we've done two things. Established a cybersecurity working group of subject matter experts that represent really every aspect of the total product life cycle for medical devices. And we have stood up a cyber incident response team under my programmatic portfolio, the Emergency Medical Countermeasures Program. A few words about our CSWG. So this is really an opportunity for bi-directional flow of information. Members of our CSWG, such as myself, I chair the CSWG, have been involved in outreach and education, building awareness by speaking to different parts of the healthcare public health sector. But it's also about our opportunity to become increasingly educated, and we encourage that opportunity. We welcome others to come and educate our subject matter experts. We do this by bringing in security researchers, bringing in security firms who have presented to us their approaches and potential solutions to some of the challenges that we all face in this arena. Importantly, it's the CSWG within the Center for Devices that is tasked with evolving the agency's thinking with respect to policy and guidance for the entire medical device product life cycle. And so therefore, over the past year, well, not only had we published the pre-market guidance, but we have shifted our focus in working on the agency's approach to post-market expectations and the considerations that are needed for strengthening cybersecurity of medical devices that are out there in the field, in use. And as one might imagine, it's these devices that are currently in use in healthcare facilities that really present the greatest challenges for manufacturers and for healthcare delivery organizations with respect to vulnerability mitigation and vulnerability remediation and protection. So this is, in fact, a very tangible example of where the complexity of this issue demands a whole-of-community, multifaceted type of an approach. All right. So, to address medical device cybersecurity, we've also engaged in a fair amount, and we'll continue to engage in a lot of collaborative activities, some of which have been with several of our federal partners. We've built a relationship with DHS within their Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, specifically a team that's called the ICS CERT, the Industrial Control Systems CERT team. We initially engaged with the ICS CERT team back in 2013 through incident response when we were first handed over that package of nearly 300 medical devices that had hard-coded passwords. But since that time, we have really built a foundation and a bridge in communicating and in coordinating with weekly conference calls with the ICS CERT team so that, number one, we maintain situational awareness on newly reported vulnerabilities that are often reported by vulnerability researchers in the field, about potential threats, and about exploits. We've also partnered with the NHISAC. Do people know what the NHISAC is here? Show of hands. Not many. Okay, so NHISAC, National Healthcare Information Sharing and Analysis Center, as every critical infrastructure sector has either an ISAC or an ISAO, an Information Sharing Analysis Organization. So FDA partnered with NHISAC through an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, that we executed last August. The purpose of this was to develop a trusted environment for information sharing on medical device vulnerabilities. This collaboration also aims to undertake adapting the NIST framework, the voluntary framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, to the medical device realm. And so it would include the concept of cyber incident response planning, recovery, and resilience as well. So in the past few months, we've had the privilege of seeing some of the early work that's being borne out by the NHISAC. This work is being done also in collaboration with another entity, an entity known as MDIS, the Medical Device Innovation Safety and Security Consortium. What's the MDIS? The MDIS is a collective of medical device manufacturers, hospital CISOs, biomed engineers, security research firms, and vulnerability researchers as they begin to set up what will be a feasibility small-scale pilot for medical device vulnerability identification, analysis or assessment, and information sharing in a trusted space. We look forward to seeing how this particular effort will take further shape over the next months and in the next year. So at this point, this is a great time for me to transition. It's a perfect segue to discuss the exciting work that we have ongoing with MITRE. MITRE is a federally funded research center. Okay. And CDRH, FDA, and MITRE have been working together to advance our CDRH medical device security vision. How so? It's by evolving a medical device vulnerability ecosystem for sharing device vulnerability and other relevant cybersecurity information that can be done in a more effective and efficient way, whether it's through various government as well as industry stakeholders. How are we doing this? Well, to start with, through various stakeholder engagement and in-depth interviews that really span across the entire ecosystem within the public health and healthcare space. Our goal is to develop a roadmap for implementing the medical device vulnerability ecosystem that can reflect the agreed upon stakeholders' roles and responsibilities. And through this effort, the objective is to design that trusted environment for collecting, analyzing, and sharing information about medical device vulnerabilities, their security, risks, and mitigations in order to advance device security. So I've covered a fair share of FDA's activities in medical device cybersecurity, leaving for last what has been arguably probably the most significant inflection point for the ecosystem, namely, this is the workshop, the FDA workshop that was convened back in October of last year, Collaborative Approaches for Medical Device and Healthcare Cybersecurity. Anybody here aware of this workshop having taken place, other than Josh? And MITRE. Okay, so this is important for us to know because obviously we're not getting our word out sufficiently, and I think it's great to have this audience that you understand where there's opportunity to work together with us in this whole of community approach. All right. So what was the purpose of this workshop? Well, first of all, let me also just say we did this workshop together with government partners, with the Department of Health and Human Services, of which we are, an agency, and the Department of Homeland Security. We were amazed by the number of participants that signed up and that attended this workshop, both on site as well as remote, both within the U.S. as well as globally. There were 1,300 participants that represented a very broad range of stakeholders. The goals were, number one, to catalyze collaboration among all stakeholders within healthcare. Secondly, to identify those barriers that impede efforts towards promoting cybersecurity. And third, let's advance the discussion on innovative approaches for building securable medical devices. What were the workshop sessions, focus areas? It was about increasing situational awareness on cyber threats. It's understanding what are the gaps and challenges. I highlighted here legacy devices because that again remains to be a very complex area, an area that we really need to pay a lot of attention to. But exploring tools and standards that can be applied to medical devices. It's about leveraging expertise that resides within the sector, as well as what can we borrow and translate from other sectors that have proven to be much more mature. And it's about establishing a collaborative model for information sharing and a shared risk assessment framework. We took what we heard and what we learned at this workshop and we split it into really two bins. We called one of them systemic challenges, and parenthetically it's important to recognize that most of the themes within systemic challenges, they're not unique to healthcare and public health. Rather, they're universal to all sectors of critical infrastructure. And then the second bin are the stakeholder challenges, and those that are more characteristic, they characterize better the culture and some of the entrenched behavior that we've seen within the healthcare community and its members. Systemic challenges. Again, I'm not going to read through all of these, but many of them you're probably very familiar with. The growing cyber threat, the fact that, and we hear this all the time across all sectors, cybersecurity, it doesn't appear to be on the radar of the C-suite. Where's that safe space for information sharing? There's no common vernacular taxonomy to talk this language. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And cybersecurity, it's not just a design issue. It is a life cycle issue. I'm going to say this several times through the talk. It's not just at the inception or the design phase. It's got to continue throughout the entire product life cycle. Stakeholder challenges, well, many of them are very similar. It's the lack of trust. It's about stakeholders addressing cybersecurity in these different silos. And some of those silos, they really don't even get the clinical environment. It's really important to understand context here. Cybersecurity researchers bring disruption to the community, disruption in a positive way. This is not meant to be pejorative, but the whole idea of disruptive innovation and thinking about things differently. And it's the fact that whether it's on the healthcare delivery side or on the manufacturing side, smaller organizations don't necessarily have the resources or the expertise to really even understand where to begin. On that note, they often don't know how to prioritize vulnerabilities. You know, you've got a list of hundreds of vulnerabilities. Where should I pay attention first? What's most important to correct or to remediate? And finally, what's the value proposition? So this gets back to the executive or C-suite. Why should I be investing in cybersecurity? Well, that point is becoming clearer and clearer as we see all of the breaches that are taking place and the astronomical costs to an organization associated with that. One of the most compelling and unanimous sentiments that was expressed at the workshop by close of day 2 was the desire to have a place to continue these important conversations. How can we take them to the next level? How do we use them as those springboards so that we can formulate actual, tangible, or concrete next steps? And it was important for us at FDA to be able to commit to our stakeholders and to all of the participants at the workshop that this was going to be different these 2 days. It wasn't going to be merely a gathering of folks and then everybody would disperse, everybody would go back to their own organization and business would carry on as usual, because there was this palpable energy in the room during that workshop and everybody wanted it sustained. So we knew we had to build on that momentum. We indicated at the workshop that we'd have to find a way to create a space for continuing these important conversations, recognizing this gets to at the very core of fostering collaboration, fostering engagement. The Handshake virtual collaboration tool, which is administered by MITRE, has been an enabling platform for ongoing discussion of topics that were covered during the workshop, plus much newer topics that have been emerging that can be brought forward by anyone who is signed up to the Handshake site on MITRE. We are very interested in growing the number of participants in these dialogues, in these conversations, and one can easily join, anybody can join Handshake, the public healthcare collaboration site, by reaching out to myself. We have an email address. We have MITRE folks here as well who are happy to sign people up. Just to give you an example of some of the recent topic areas where there has been some really good conversation. Mobile medical devices, how are those being secured? The new executive order, information sharing and analysis organizations, what does that mean? And how do we engage in that? Cyberstorm 5, an exercise that's going to take place in February 2016. Well, you know, the planning for that exercise across the entire United States is happening right now. And we are engaging manufacturers, industry, healthcare organizations, all parties to participate in both the planning and the playing of that exercise, because that's going to be the opportunity for us to understand where the gaps are for response and for recovery and what we should be expecting. I'd like to now pivot for a few moments to underscore some of the key principles that were included in the final guidance on pre-market submissions that was issued last October. Okay, so FDA recognizes medical device security, shared responsibility, shared ownership among stakeholders. including healthcare facilities, patients, providers, manufacturers. Cybersecurity should be addressed during the design phase and development. It's that concept of baking it in, not bolting it on. Secure design starts with a good process. Design inputs that are related to cybersecurity should be established. And the vulnerability and management approach has to be part of software validation and risk analysis. This is part of our regulation. It's part of design controls and the quality system regulation for medical devices. This guidance was written so that it would align with the NIST Voluntary Cybersecurity Framework's 5 core functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Important point here, it's important that manufacturers carefully consider the balance between cybersecurity safeguards and the usability of the device within its intended environment of use. Why? Because we need to ensure that the security controls match up, that they're appropriate for the intended use environment. After all, no one wants an outcome where security controls actually hinder access to a device that needs to be deployed during a patient emergency. And then, again, to highlight here in bold, okay, point that I made earlier, FDA typically does not need to review or approve medical device software changes that are made solely to strengthen cybersecurity. So finally, what does FDA expect in establishing a cybersecurity risk management program? First and foremost, it's about adopting a cybersecurity culture. And this is, again, in keeping with the theme of total product lifecycle approach. We've talked a bit about the pre-market side, and the list on the left-hand portion of this slide really comes out of language in our pre-market guidance. So I'd like to really focus or draw your attention to the right-hand part of the slide, the post-market one, which highlights this dynamic and very iterative nature of cyber risk assessment. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to say this and I'll say it twice. New vulnerabilities will become identified throughout the lifespan of a product. Again, new vulnerabilities emerge and become identified throughout the lifespan in spite of, irrespective of, the best attempts to get that security built into the initial design. So what does that mean? It means that these vulnerabilities are going to warrant new analyses for clinical impact, as well as the need to engage in post-market surveillance and information sharing analysis. What does it mean to adopt a cybersecurity culture? Well, one place to start is with the NIST voluntary framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. I talked about the 5 core functions that are identified in this framework. There are experiences that ought to be gleaned and lessons learned from across other sectors where best practices have already been put in place. And many of these can and should be adopted by healthcare public health. Again, risk mitigation has to be addressed on a continuum of the total product life cycle, from the concept and design phase all the way through the obsolescence of the device. This means what? This means thinking ahead for healthcare delivery organizations as well as manufacturers during the procurement activities to what the future foreseen as well as potentially the unforeseen needs are going to be, and introducing them into contract language when purchasing devices. It means vendors working with their customers to develop more securable devices. How so? Through both implementation of design features as well as understanding what the compensating controls are within that unique use environment. And finally, by putting in place cyber hygiene. So what do we mean by cyber hygiene? Cyber hygiene is that state of diligent control of a device's operation. It's exercised in the use environment, and it's considered best practice by the security community. We're defining cyber hygiene here as being comprised of three major categories. It's number one, the safe and proper configuration of available features. Number two, it's about least privilege access to control functions. And third, it's about upholding cybersecurity routine servicing. Now, what should be fairly obvious about these three categories is that ownership and responsibility for cybersecurity is shared. Cyber hygiene is not solely in the hands of the medical device manufacturers, but it resides well within the controls and the execution of the end user facility. And it's a universally shared perspective by security researchers, by firms, by government, that simply undertaking best practices of cyber hygiene is going to reduce the potential for exploit and attack by a significant percentage. So healthcare and public health as a sector, it has a huge opportunity here to put these practices in place as very basic fundamental measures to decrease the risk of vulnerability exploit. In summary, we talked about the following key takeaways: establishing cybersecurity risk management programs, making cyber hygiene paramount, creating that trusted environment for information sharing, seeking to foster this whole of community approach, and I'm talking to this community as well. Software updates, again, they do not, by and large, require new submissions to or notifications to the FDA if they're part of routine servicing, and FDA is not going to be prescriptive with respect to risk analyses. As we look forward towards the future, we envision this continuous cycle that really draws upon information from all of the incoming feeds here that further drive or inform action. So there's the stakeholder collaboration piece, the industry, healthcare organizations, partners, researchers, and experts. It's about being able to enable this platform for maintaining awareness, whether it's intentional or unintentional threats. It's FDA's responsibility to define clearly what our regulatory expectations are. Total product life cycle here again, on the pre-market side, as new products come in, as well as for the entire lifespan of that product. And then engaging in post-market surveillance, for which we need the entire community's involvement, because this is going to feed upon and iterate the ability to address vulnerabilities that are out there. And with that, I just want to thank Josh and thank the entire audience for this opportunity to speak to you on behalf of FDA, and I'm happy if there's time to address any questions that you have. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 questions if they're short. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Schwartz, for your presentation. I'm wondering, it seems to me like the FDA would be exactly the place to do some sort of prescriptive requirement. You won't tell medical device manufacturers how to do security, right? But it seems to me like they ought to be required to say, we are doing this. Like not just recommended, but required plans for how they address security over the life cycle of the device. And I'm wondering who would affect that change, or what you think that's
So, great question. And we do address that. So, to mention a couple of things. Generally, what the FDA does is, obviously there are regulations, and then there's guidance. Guidance is often articulates policy, and guidance would often also say that these are non-binding recommendations. Recommendations, however, are fairly understood to be, this is really the way you should go, industry. However, if you can provide another alternative means and justify it, the FDA is certainly willing and open to hearing what that alternate path is. With respect to a requirement, a regulation is a requirement. We consider cybersecurity under the quality systems regulation. We do not need to seek out new regulations specific to cybersecurity because we consider that to be embedded within what is part of quality systems. So yes, it is a requirement to address cybersecurity, and you'll hear more and more about our talking about this aspect that safety and effectiveness of medical devices means that they need to be secure as well. It's part of that picture. Now, I will grant you that there are vulnerabilities out there with respect to devices that may not have a safety concern, a patient safety concern associated with them. That does not mean that we do not want to see those vulnerabilities addressed. They should be as part of, again, routine servicing and making enhancements, especially because we're looking at this in that proactive and in that preventative manner. We don't want to see a vulnerability that may not have today a patient safety or public health concern evolve into something in 5 months or a year or 2 years later that does trip the wire and does have a patient safety concern. So being proactive, being forward-leaning in that regard is something that we are, strongly encouraging. And as we look to, one of the things I mentioned is our working group that's responsible for defining policy and and writing new guidance is working on this post-market piece. The post-market piece, again, is really where the bulk of the issues lie, rather than on the pre-market side. So I hope that kind of addresses both what guidance does and then the regulatory nature.
One of the things we talked about this morning is some of the really well-intentioned security researchers are incredibly useful and helpful to this process, and some of them, even with the best of intentions, have been very, very harmful to building trust and rapport with the multiple stakeholders. Can you contrast the things that have maybe been less helpful and the things that have been more helpful so that this talent pool can be their best contributors?
Absolutely. So our mission again is, to protect and to advance the public health. And how, as an agency, we do that at large, not just the Center for Devices, but across all of the product centers, is looking at benefit risk, correct? We always have to weigh out what benefit and risks are. When disclosures are made in the public domain, whether it's through media or other means, without providing necessarily an understanding of context, and what, first of all, mitigations may actually exist in that environment of use already, what the compensating controls are, or what the potential is for that disclosure creating hysteria among the public, or anxiety, so much so that individuals, that patients and their families become concerned about the safety and effectiveness of devices that are in current use. That becomes problematic to the public trust. That can become very damaging. And again, as Josh pointed out, we recognize that the passion and the mission of the researcher is in the, with his or her heart in the right place to protect the public. But what we need to make sure, with the understanding, especially with so many devices out there that have vulnerabilities present, that there needs to be a systematic way of dealing with these types of vulnerabilities and appropriately analyzing, mitigating or remediating them, or taking, if FDA needs to take that appropriate action, by understanding, again, the entire landscape of what the impact is going to be on public health. That is the better route to take. It's the better route to take because, again, lots of devices out there that serve critical, sometimes life-saving functions. Taking those devices off the market is not a quick and easy solution to a problem when those devices are delivering a critical care. And again, this comes back to measuring the benefit versus risk on a patient-to-patient basis as well as on the public health at large. We certainly do not want to induce what becomes, quote-unquote, a critical shortage of particular types of devices, and then patients don't have the means of receiving the type of necessary care that they have to receive because vulnerabilities have been identified in a public domain in a way that does not allow for, first of all, that coordinated disclosure in a responsible manner and in a means where the vulnerabilities understood, the mitigations have already been identified, whatever remediation needs to occur, or again, if the FDA needs to take an action with the manufacturer, that we can do so. So the contrast there is one where we can work with ICS CERT, and ICS CERT often works directly with the research community, as do we, and with the manufacturers to understand, excuse me, to understand various vulnerabilities, and to make that assessment contextualizing it within the clinical environment and working to see what can be done to put in the appropriate controls so that it's no longer an uncontrolled vulnerability, it's a controlled vulnerability and one that can be overcome. But when a disclosure is put out in the public space that we consider to be uncontrolled and that attracts attention by others that may have bad intent, or maybe they don't have bad intent, but they don't understand, they may not have the maturity, especially on the younger age, to understand what the downstream consequences are of trying something out, because it's out there, because the code's out there, and wow, this looks quite cool, look, I can do the following, without thinking about what might be the impact on patients, on public health. So what we ask for and what we would like to see happen, and we're starting to see that wonderful shift, is in really leveraging, capitalizing upon the expertise that the research community has to educate us, and for us to be able to educate the research community in understanding what the constraints that we have to be mindful of, and it's more than constraints, it's really the concerns that we have to be mindful of within the healthcare and public health sector. So I hope that maybe gets at it a little bit.
It's